Main script. On March 4th, 2025, at exactly the moment U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum went live, LCBO employees across Ontario began pulling bottles off shelves. Not one brand, not one category. Thousands of American products gone. Bourbon from Kentucky, wine from California, craft beer from Colorado. By the close of business that day, the empty shelves had already become the most photographed retail story in Canadian history. And nobody in Washington saw it coming. That silence, that complete failure of anticipation, is what this story is really about. Because what happened next wasn't just a trade countermeasure. It was a demonstration of a kind of leverage that no tariff schedule, no Section 232 investigation, no trade representative's threat had ever encountered. Canada had found the one pressure point that hits American industries where they are most vulnerable, not at the border, but at the shelf. Think about what that means for the man running a small distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky. A guy who spent 20 years perfecting a single-barrel bourbon, who built a business on the assumption that Canada, his second-largest export market, would always be open, who woke up on March 5th, 2025, and watched his order pipeline evaporate, not slow down, not shrink, vanish. That man, call him the American distiller, is the human anchor of everything that follows, because everything Washington dismissed as a symbolic gesture landed on him like a structural demolition. And here is the thesis. 1 year into this quiet economic war, Canada's bottle-by-bottle strategy has not buckled under American pressure. It has hardened. And the clock on CUSMA renegotiation, the trade agreement that governs over $1 trillion in annual commerce, is now ticking toward July 1st, 2026, with the alcohol ban sitting at the center of the table like an unexploded device. We know the damage is real because the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, released the numbers themselves. U.S. spirits exports to Canada fell more than 70% between March and December 2025. 70%. Not a projection, not a model, a documented collapse reported in their own annual export data. American whiskey sales to Canada dropped from $221 million in 2024 to $89 million for the full year, and the vast majority of that $89 million was front-loaded in January and February before the ban hit. In Q2 alone, exports fell 85%, crashing below $10 million for the first time on record. The Kentucky Distillers Association confirmed U.S. whiskey exports are now at a 10-year low, with 50% of all Canadian exports lost in a single calendar year. The Ontario government's own Freedom of Information releases have confirmed what the LCBO letter to U.S. suppliers made explicit. The province intended to use this moment to permanently shift shelf space toward Canadian producers. That letter was not a polite notice. It was a business ultimatum delivered to every American brand that had relied on the world's largest single liquor purchasing agency for decades. 3 separate statements from Canadian officials in the final week of April 2026 have confirmed the position is unchanged and coordinated. Premier Doug Ford, Prime Minister Mark Carney, and BC Minister Ravi Kahlon all delivered the same message within 72 hours of each other. The shelves refill when the tariffs come off, not before. Let's go back to the room where this escalated. Not a formal negotiation chamber, A Senate hearing in Washington on April 22, 2026. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is testifying. He is asked about Canada's liquor ban, and he calls it outrageous. He calls it disrespectful. The tone is one of genuine irritation, the kind that reveals surprise. Lutnick is not performing outrage for the cameras. He is actually rattled, because what was supposed to be a temporary retail inconvenience has become a formal trade irritant, cited in the U.S. Trade Representative's annual report on foreign trade barriers. The same week, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer tells the House Ways and Means Committee that Washington is kind of at the end of our rope. He has flagged the liquor ban as a precondition in CUSMA renewal talks. He wants it lifted before serious negotiations can begin. Canada's answer, delivered through Doug Ford the following morning, is surgical. American alcohol will only go back on shelves when the U.S. removes its tariffs. The simplicity of that response is the point. There is no ambiguity to negotiate around. There is no face-saving middle position. The condition is binary, and the Canadians know it. What Lutnick revealed by calling it outrageous, and what Greer revealed by citing it as a roadblock, is the thing Canada needed them to reveal. The ban matters enough that they cannot ignore it, and because it matters, Canada's leverage is real. That is the gut punch. A retail decision made by provincial liquor boards became a recognized instrument of geopolitical pressure against the most powerful economy on earth. Receipt 1. Canada was the second largest export market for American spirits in 2024, worth $221 million annually. The LCBO alone was responsible for a significant portion of that, described by multiple trade groups as one of the largest single buyers of alcohol anywhere in the world. When Ontario pulled the plug, it didn't damage American spirits. It severed an artery. By Q2 2025, exports had dropped 85%. By end of year, American whiskey exports globally hit a 10-year low, down 19%, losing $250 million in total value. For the distiller in Bardstown, that means his entire Canadian revenue, which may have represented 30 or 40% of his export income, simply ceased to exist. His heating bills didn't change. His aging inventory costs didn't change. His payroll didn't change. His revenue did. But that's only part of it. Receipt 2. The shelves did not stay empty. That is the structural shift the American trade lobby is most afraid of. Ontario wine sales climbed 67% year over year. Ontario craft wineries reported a 60% increase in sales. Local distilleries gained LCBO shelf placement in weeks, a process that normally takes approximately 1 year. European brands moved in. Asian suppliers moved in. Consumer habits, which economists will tell you are among the stickiest variables in retail, began to reset. Discus CEO Chris Swanger warned in October 2025 that international consumers are increasingly opting for domestically produced spirits or imports from countries other than the U.S., signaling a shift away from great American spirits brands. This is not rhetoric. This is the industry's own chief executive flagging a permanent realignment of consumer preference. Think about what that means for the distiller in Bardstown right now. Even if a trade deal is reached tomorrow, even if the tariffs disappear and the shelves refill, the Canadian bar manager who discovered an Ontario rye or a Scottish single malt or a Japanese whiskey during the 14 months of the ban, that manager has a new house pour. He has a new supplier relationship. He has a new story to tell his customers. The Bardstown distiller is not just fighting to re-enter a market. He is fighting to reclaim shelf space that someone else now owns. Here's where it gets worse. Receipt 3. Ontario is currently sitting on approximately 80 million Canadian dollars in American alcohol it cannot sell. Manitoba and Nova Scotia, unable to stomach the warehouse cost, are planning to liquidate their remaining stocks and donate proceeds to local charities. British Columbia is quietly offloading inventory to hospitality outlets. And in a development that captures the absurdity perfectly, Global News reported in March 2026 that roughly $2 million worth of American booze in Ontario LCBO warehouses has simply expired. Not donated, not sold, poured out. The economic wound is not only on the American side, but the critical difference is this. Canada chose this cost deliberately. America did not choose to absorb it. It was imposed on them. Receipt 4. The ban is now explicitly woven into the CUSMA renegotiation framework. According to reporting from multiple Canadian outlets in late April 2026, the Trump administration has demanded what sources describe as an entry fee, a package of upfront concessions from Canada before formal talks can even begin. Dropping the provincial liquor bans is on that list. Canada's position, stated by Prime Minister Carney on April 23rd, is that the entry fee concept is rejected. Canada will not make concessions before sitting down. The alcohol ban stays until tariffs come off. That means the ban is now a negotiating chip at the table, governing over $1.2 trillion in annual bilateral trade. A retail decision made by provincial liquor boards has become a variable in one of the most consequential trade agreements in North American history. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. You have been watching a trade war in your news feed for over a year. You have seen the headlines about steel tariffs and auto sector disruptions and lumber duties. But this particular story, the one about the bottles, barely made the main news cycle in the United States. That is not an accident, because what Canada figured out is something Washington's trade advisors genuinely did not account for. The most effective retaliation is not the one that gets the most press. It is the one that is quiet enough to look symbolic, but precise enough to cause structural pain. Here is what every other outlet is missing. The alcohol ban is not the real story. The real story is what the ban proved about how provincial governments inside a federation can operate as independent economic actors without triggering the same diplomatic escalation as a federal-level tariff. When Ottawa imposes a counter tariff, it is a government-to-government move. Washington responds with government-to-government pressure. But when Ontario's LCBO pulls bottles off shelves, it is technically a retail procurement decision. It is a buyer choosing not to buy. And the World Trade Organization has no mechanism designed to adjudicate that. Greer can call it a trade barrier. Lutnick can call it disrespectful. But there is no legal instrument that forces a provincial liquor board to stock a product it has decided not to stock. Let me translate that for you. What Canada discovered is that the most powerful economic weapon in a trade war is sometimes not a tariff. It is a purchasing decision. And purchasing decisions, unlike tariffs, exist in a legal gray zone that the rules of international trade have never fully addressed. That ambiguity is not a bug in Canada's strategy. It is the strategy. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Canada lifts the ban before July 1st? Or does this go to the wire? I want to know what you think happens next. Now here is what you are about to understand that nobody has laid out cleanly. Three things are happening simultaneously in this situation, and they are operating on completely different timescales, which is exactly why the pressure feels so asymmetric. First, Canada's position strengthens the longer it holds. Every week that passes without American bourbon on LCBO shelves is a week in which a Canadian consumer builds a new preference. Markets follow habits, and habits compound. American trade officials are operating on a political clock. They want a deal before the CUSMA review checkpoint. Canada is operating on a consumer behavior clock, which runs much slower and, critically, runs in Canada's favor. In plain language, time is on Canada's side in a way that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with how people develop loyalty to a brand of whiskey. Second, the ban has created an internal constituency inside the United States that is now pressuring its own government. Discus filed formal submissions to the Trump administration asking it to advocate for the removal of Canadian bans. The Kentucky Distillers Association went public with their export collapse. American distillers are lobbying Washington, not Ottawa. That is the structural reversal Canada engineered. The people applying pressure on the White House are not Canadians. They are Kentucky bourbon producers, Tennessee distillers, California wine exporters. Canada turned American industries against the White House's trade strategy by making those industries feel the cost directly. What that actually tells you is that Canada did not need to match American tariff power dollar for dollar. It needed to activate American industries as a proxy lobbying force inside Washington, and it worked. Third, notice what Canada has not done. Canada has not threatened to permanently exclude American spirits. It has not moved to legislate the ban into permanent law. It has not declared American bourbon a prohibited product. Every Canadian official statement has preserved the reversibility of the ban, explicitly tying it to tariff removal. That restraint is not weakness, it is precision. By keeping the door technically open, Canada prevents the ban from being characterized as protectionism at the WTO. By making the condition explicit, tariffs off, shelves refilled, Canada maintains the moral and rhetorical high ground. The doctrine here is leverage through proportionality. Maximum pressure, minimum legal exposure, with a clearly stated off-ramp that places the decision entirely in Washington's hands. The historical analogy that fits is not another trade war. It is a siege. Canada identified a fortified position, cut off the supply line at the most expensive point, and waited. Sieges are won not by the side with the most artillery, but by the side with the most patience and the clearest objective. Eric Gregory, president of the Kentucky Distillers Association, put it plainly in March 2026. We still keep in touch with a lot of our partners in Canada, and they want us back. That sentence is doing enormous analytical work. It says that Canadian buyers, bar managers, and restaurant operators have not turned hostile. They miss the product. But they are not in a position to stock it. The ban has decoupled consumer preference from purchasing power, and the gap between those two things is exactly where Canada's leverage lives. Chris Swanger at Discus has been more alarmed. Exports remain a critical path forward, especially amid a slowdown in domestic sales and high inventory levels. He is describing an industry that needed Canada to absorb surplus stock and is now watching that absorption channel close while domestic demand softens simultaneously. Industry analysts have pointed out that Kentucky alone is sitting on 16 million barrels of aging bourbon, a record inventory level, with fewer and fewer markets to sell into. BC's Ravi Kahlon delivered the province's position with an almost academic calm. I say to British Columbians who want to drink Kentucky bourbon that they will have to wait until the tariffs are resolved. Not until talks begin, not until progress is made, until resolution. And when people on opposite sides of this issue agree on one thing, that the ban is now the single most tangible pressure point in the bilateral relationship, you pay attention. To be fair, and this argument deserves to be made seriously, there is a genuine case that Canada's liquor ban has complicated more than it has clarified. The American critique runs like this: the ban is not legally equivalent to a tariff. It punishes specific American industries that had no role in designing the tariff policy. And it has introduced an emotional and symbolic dimension into what should be a technocratic trade negotiation. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra's comment that the ban is why Trump's team has called Canada mean and nasty to deal with is not just bluster. It reflects a real political dynamic where the optics of empty bourbon shelves have hardened White House positions in ways that may make compromise harder, not easier. There is also an economic counterargument. Ontario's hospitality sector is paying a price. BC's liquor distribution branch has seen wine profits drop from $150 million to $80 million annually. Canadian restaurant owners who built their cocktail programs around American spirits are absorbing those costs. The ban is not free for Canada. It is a chosen pain, and chosen pain can create political pressure from within. Those are real arguments. But here is the structural reality that overrides them. The pain Canada is absorbing is distributed and diffuse. The pain Canada is inflicting is concentrated and industry-specific. And concentrated pain creates concentrated political pressure. Distributed pain diffuses into general economic noise. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the engineering. In the next 30 to 90 days, the outcome of this situation sorts into two distinct scenarios for the distiller in Bardstown. In the first scenario, CUSMA talks advance, tariff relief is offered on steel and autos and lumber, and Canada's premiers begin restocking American products. The distiller gets his market back, but not his old market. He gets back a market that spent 14 months learning to love alternatives. He will need to re-earn placements, renegotiate with buyers, and accept that his Canadian revenue recovery will be slow and partial. That is the good outcome. It is not the outcome of a year ago. In the second scenario, talks stall. The CUSMA July 1st checkpoint passes without a framework deal, and the ban extends into 2027. In that scenario, the Canadian consumer behavior shift becomes semi-permanent. Local distilleries that received LCBO shelf space are now established brands with loyal customers. European and Asian imports have secured distribution relationships. American spirits are not just absent, they are forgotten. That is not hyperbole. That is how consumer markets work when a product disappears for 18 to 24 months. Politically, the ban is already reshaping the domestic American map in ways the White House did not anticipate. The loudest voices asking the Trump administration to resolve the Canada dispute are not Democrats. They are Republican senators and House members from Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and Texas, the distilling states. That is a coalition the White House cannot dismiss, and it was built entirely by Canada's purchasing decision. At the systemic level, this episode has demonstrated something that will outlast the current trade dispute. Provincial purchasing power, when coordinated with federal political will, is a form of economic leverage that existing trade architecture has no mechanism to counter. That precedent does not disappear when the bottles go back on shelves. It becomes a template. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about Bourbon or tariffs or even CUSMA. It is about whether the rules that have governed cross-border economic relationships for the past 30 years still mean anything when one side decides the rules were always written in their opponent's favor. Canada didn't break any rules. Canada just stopped buying things it didn't have to buy. And that alone was enough to put the world's most powerful economy on defense. Return to the distiller in Bardstown one final time. Right now, in April 2026, he is watching the news out of Ottawa and Toronto with the kind of attention you only pay when your livelihood depends on it. He is reading every statement from Greer and Lutnick and Ford and Carney with the same question underneath all of them. When do I get my market back? And here is the silence that answers him louder than any statement. Not one Canadian premier has wavered. Not one provincial government has suggested a partial exemption. Not one LCBO shelf has been quietly restocked while nobody was looking. That unity, that absolute, unwavering coordination between provinces that often agree on very little, is the thing nobody in Washington can fully explain. Because it requires you to believe that ordinary people, politicians from different parties in different provinces with different economic interests, looked at the situation and decided together that this was worth it, that the principle was worth the pain. And when that many people decide something is worth it, the calculus of the person applying pressure changes completely. Because you can negotiate with someone who has a price. It is much harder to negotiate with someone who has decided the principle is the price. The moral truth underneath all the data is simple. Canada did not escalate this trade war. It did not match steel tariffs with steel tariffs, or threaten auto sectors with auto sectors. It stopped buying drinks, and that was enough. Which tells you something uncomfortable about where power actually lives in the modern economy. It lives not in the weapons you are willing to fire, but in the purchases you are willing to withhold. And the final twist? The bottles sitting in Ontario's LCBO warehouses, $80 million in American whiskey gathering dust, while $2 million worth expires. Those bottles are not a failure of Canada's strategy. They are its proof of concept. Canada bought the product, pulled it off the shelf, absorbed the sunk cost, and held the line anyway. That is not a country bluffing. That is a country that has done the math and decided it is winning.